"You're being disinherited, Agnes," my husband, Arthur, said, his voice devoid of emotion as he slid the revised will across the polished mahogany table in his study. Across from him, his new, much younger legal assistant, Felicity, smirked, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against a leather-bound folder. I signed, a strange calm settling over me, and walked out with a dignity he clearly didn't expect. The next morning, at the emergency family meeting Arthur had called to announce his revised estate plans, I stood up, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. "Before congratulations are in order," I said, my voice steady, "the family should know who actually holds the true legacy of the sterling fortune." The shock on their faces, especially Arthur's, made 50 years of silent sacrifice worth every single second. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a simmering resolve, as I pulled into the sweeping driveway of Sterling Manor. The familiar Georgian mansion loomed before me, a monument to the life Arthur and I had built over 5 decades. The rose garden I'd meticulously tended since our wedding, each bloom a testament to enduring care, seemed oblivious to the seismic shift that had just fractured my world. Inside, I methodically removed my cashmere shawl and placed my handbag on the antique console table in the grand foyer. The house was silent, a silence that had grown increasingly hollow over the years. Arthur wouldn't be home tonight. He texted that he had pressing legal matters to attend to, another flimsy excuse added to a growing collection of half-truths and outright lies. I walked into the kitchen, the heart of the home, where countless family meals and celebrations had unfolded. I poured myself a generous measure of the rare single malt scotch Arthur had been saving for his 75th birthday next month. Somehow, I doubted we'd be celebrating that milestone now. The irony was a bitter taste on my tongue. At 72, I had just been effectively disinherited from the fortune I'd helped build, by the husband who was systematically erasing me from his life, all for the sake of a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. My mind drifted back to 3 years ago, when Felicity Thorne, fresh out of law school, had joined Arthur's private legal practice. Arthur, always one to surround himself with youth and beauty, had been immediately taken with her sharp mind and even sharper wit. I'd initially dismissed it as a fleeting infatuation, a harmless distraction for a man entering his twilight years. I hadn't recognized the calculated ambition in her eyes, the way she subtly undermined my influence, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than a ghost in my own home. I took my scotch to the library, a room filled with the scent of old books and unspoken secrets. I unlocked the hidden compartment in the back of my desk, a secret only I knew. Inside was a worn velvet box. I pulled out a single, yellowed document, the original prenuptial agreement from 1975, signed by Arthur Sterling and myself, Agnes Albright. The document that Arthur believed had been superseded by countless subsequent wills and trusts, but which my late, brilliant attorney, Mr. Henderson, had meticulously ensured remained legally binding through every amendment, every corporate restructuring, every new venture. I took another sip of scotch, a small, grim smile touching my lips. Tomorrow's family meeting would not go as Arthur and Felicity expected. That morning had been surreal, sitting across from my husband of 50 years as he informed me with clinical detachment that my name was being removed from the primary beneficiaries of his will. "The reorganization of my estate requires streamlining," Arthur had explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "The new trust structure is more efficient." Felicity had stood slightly behind him, a tablet in hand, her expression professionally sympathetic, but unable to hide the triumph in her eyes. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, the one I'd seen in Arthur's safe last month and assumed was a gift for my upcoming birthday, glinted in the study light. "We need to focus on core assets," she'd added, using the corporate jargon Arthur had always despised until recently. "Family legacies, while admirable, aren't driving generational wealth." The irony of her statement had almost made me laugh. If only they knew what would be driving Arthur's legacy and his carefully constructed image, down by this time tomorrow. I'd maintained my composure, signed the new will without argument, and walked out past the stunned household staff. Many had been with the Sterling family since the beginning, Since the days when Arthur and I had started with little more than ambition and boundless hope. None of them knew what I knew. Few people remembered that the sterling fortune had not begun with Arthur's inherited wealth, but with my inheritance from my grandmother. Every penny of the $500,000 she'd left me had funded Arthur's first critical business ventures. We'd kept my investment quiet, at Arthur's insistence. Investors and partners need to see me as the driving force, he'd explained. Having my wife as the primary investor might undermine confidence. I'd agreed, believing in his vision and our partnership. On paper, I became a minor shareholder in his fledgling companies, my name deliberately omitted from public records. But Mr. Henderson had insisted on a contingency clause that would prove to be my salvation. In the event of my disinheritance without cause, my original investment, along with a significant portion of all subsequent profits generated from those initial ventures, would revert solely to me, with controlling interest in the Sterling Family Trust. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Henderson's successor, young Mr. Davies. "Everything in place for tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late," I replied with a simple, "I'll be there." Then I sent another message to Benedict Sterling, Arthur's younger brother, a man who had always viewed Arthur's ruthless ambition with quiet disdain. "Benedict, I need to address the family before Arthur's announcement tomorrow. It's urgent. Please trust me on this." His response came quickly. "Agnes, what's going on?" "Arthur mentioned you were stepping back from family affairs." I typed carefully. "I didn't step back, Benedict. I was pushed. Tomorrow, you'll understand why that distinction matters legally." Setting my phone aside, I walked through the house touching familiar objects, wondering which ones I'd care to keep when everything was finally divided. The wedding photos on the mantel. The antique globe we'd bought in Florence. The first dollar Arthur's initial company had earned framed in his study. So many memories, now tainted. I climbed the grand staircase to our bedroom and opened the closet. Arthur's side was half empty. He'd been gradually moving things to his downtown penthouse for months. I'd noticed, but convinced myself it was for convenience on late nights. Another self-deception. In the bathroom, most of his toiletries were gone. Only his expensive cologne remained, the one I'd given him for his last birthday. How long? Had he been planning this? Had Felicity been more than his legal assistant from the beginning, or had that relationship evolved over time? I thought about the family meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Arthur would be presenting his revised will, which included the announcement of his engagement to Felicity, a detail I'd discovered in the presentation notes he'd carelessly left open on his laptop last week. Little did he know that Mr. Davies had been working with Benedict's attorney since Mr. Henderson's death 6 months ago. Mr. Henderson had known about my original investment, had helped structure it to protect me. In fact, his final gift to me had been a sealed letter, revealing Arthur's plans to dilute my influence through a series of maneuvers that would have succeeded had I remained passively accepting of his decisions. My disinheritance had triggered the clause that would be Arthur's undoing. I packed a small overnight bag and left a note on the kitchen counter. "Staying at the lake house tonight. We'll talk after tomorrow's meeting." As I drove toward the secluded property that had been my sanctuary over the years, a strange calm settled over me. 50 years of marriage was ending. But something else, something truthful, was about to begin. Tomorrow would change everything. The Sterling Manor drawing room fell silent as I entered the next morning. The assembled family members, Arthur's siblings, their spouses, a few cousins, all averted their eyes as I approached. All except Benedict Sterling, who rose halfway from his armchair, confusion evident on his kind face. "Agnes, I didn't expect," he began. "I invited her," Arthur interrupted smoothly, adjusting his silk tie. Felicity sat beside him, elegant in a tailored cream suit I recognized from a high-end boutique I frequented. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd positioned herself exactly where I used to sit during important family discussions, notebook open, pen poised. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering in my chest. I took the empty seat at the far end of the long antique table, directly opposite Arthur. Arthur cleared his throat. Before we get to the revised estate plans, I have two announcements to make. His eyes briefly met mine. A flicker of what might have been regret quickly replaced by resolve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As some of you may have heard, Arthur continued, Agnes has decided to step back from active involvement in the family's financial affairs. Several family members shifted uncomfortably. Benedict frowned, glancing between Arthur and me. The Sterling Family Trust will be restructured under my sole discretion, effective immediately, Arthur continued. Felicity, as my new legal counsel, will absorb those responsibilities. Felicity, a talented young lawyer Arthur had recently promoted, looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with how she'd received the promotion. And on a personal note, Arthur's voice softened as he turned to Felicity, taking her hand. I'm pleased to announce that Felicity and I have decided to marry. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Benedict's mouth dropped open. Arthur's sister, Clara, suddenly became fascinated with her teacup. No one congratulated them. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. I understand this comes as a surprise, Arthur said, his practiced smile firmly in place. Agnes and I have been separated for some time, though we kept it private. Another lie. We'd slept in the same bed just 3 nights ago. We wanted to be transparent with the family before rumors began circulating, Felicity added, her voice professionally modulated. We believe in the future of the Sterling legacy and want to ensure a smooth transition. Benedict cleared his throat. Arthur, perhaps this personal announcement should have been handled differently. Actually, I interrupted calmly, opening the velvet box I'd brought. Before we move on, I need to address the family on a matter of corporate governance, or rather family governance. Arthur's smile faltered. We have a full agenda today, Agnes. Perhaps this can wait. It cannot, I said firmly. Benedict, as the eldest sibling, I'm formally requesting the floor. Benedict hesitated, glancing at Arthur, then nodded. The floor is yours, Agnes. I stood, distributing copies of the original prenuptial agreement and subsequent legal amendments that Mr. Davies had prepared the previous evening. What I'm about to share will impact today's agenda considerably. I apologize for the disruption, but recent events have forced my hand. Arthur leaned forward, his knuckles whitening against the polished table. What is this? The truth, I replied simply. I activated the small portable projector Mr. Davies had given me. The first slide showed the original incorporation documents of Sterling Ventures, dated February 1975, 50 years ago. Sterling Ventures was founded with an initial investment of $500,000, I began. That investment came from my inheritance. Every penny my grandmother left me. Murmurs rippled through the room. Arthur's face darkened. For reasons that seemed valid at the time, we agreed to minimize my role on paper. Arthur would be the public face of the company, while I remained a silent partner with contractual protections. I advanced to the next slide, showing a complex ownership structure. When Arthur's family wealth was integrated in 1980, and we rebranded as Sterling Enterprises, my ownership was further obscured, but legally protected through a series of agreements drafted by Mr. Henderson. Arthur shot to his feet. This is ancient history and irrelevant to today's meeting. On the contrary, I continued steadily, it's directly relevant to yesterday's events. I turned to face the family members directly. Yesterday afternoon, I was effectively disinherited from the primary beneficiaries of Arthur's will, without cause. Benedict looked sharply at Arthur. You said she was stepping back. A misunderstanding, Arthur said quickly. The restructuring was used as pretext for my disinheritance, I finished, which triggered a specific clause in our founding agreement. I advanced to the slide Mr. Davies had titled Contingency Conversion. The legal language was highlighted in bold. Upon disinheritance without cause of Agnes Albright Sterling, all Class B shares in Sterling Enterprises convert to Class A voting shares at a ratio of 3-to-1, effective immediately. The room went completely still. In practical terms, I continued, my voice the only sound in the stunned silence. As of yesterday at 2:17 p.m., When I signed those revised will papers, my ownership stake increased from 22% to 66% of voting shares in Sterling Enterprises. Clara, always quick with numbers, gasped. That's controlling interest. Arthur's face had lost all color. This can't be legal. These agreements were superseded years ago. I nodded to Mr. Davies, who was already flipping through the documents I'd provided. The language is clear, he said slowly, professional even in his shock. And there's a notarized addendum signed during each restructuring, preserving these terms. He looked up at Arthur. Did you know about this? Arthur's silence was answer enough. Mr. Henderson knew, I said quietly. He helped ensure these protections remained in place through every corporate evolution. He left me a letter before he died, warning me that Arthur was planning to dilute my influence through a series of maneuvers that would have worked had I remained passively accepting of his decisions. Felicity was frantically scrolling through her tablet, likely searching for legal loopholes. As majority shareholder, I continued, my first action is to call for a vote of no confidence in the current head of the Sterling Family Trust, effective immediately. Arthur slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. You can't just walk in and… I can, I interrupted calmly. And I have. Benedict, as the eldest sibling, would you please call the vote? Benedict looked between us. 50 years of family loyalty warring with his duty to the family legacy. I need to consult with legal first. Of course, I nodded. But while we're waiting, I think it's important that the family understands something. I'm not doing this out of vengeance. I looked directly at Arthur for the first time. I'm doing this because the same ethical flexibility that led you to betray your wife has been applied to family decisions. And that puts everything we've built at risk. The drawing room erupted into controlled chaos. Mr. Davies huddled with Benedict and Clara, examining the legal documents. Arthur's cousin Robert was furiously calculating numbers on his phone. Felicity had pulled Arthur into the corner, their urgent whispers just audible enough to hear her panicked. Fix this. I sat calmly, watching the storm I'd unleashed. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Davies. On my way. Stall if needed. As I waited, the tension in the room seemed to fade around me, replaced by memories flooding back. The Arthur standing before me now, rigid with anger, eyes cold with calculation, was unrecognizable from the man I'd fallen in love with decades ago. My mind drifted back to spring 1974. I was 22 years old, working as a research assistant at the local university, when a tall, lanky man with earnest eyes and unruly brown hair knocked on my office doorframe. "Excuse me," he said, suit jacket slightly rumpled. "I'm Arthur Sterling, from the business department. I need to discuss the feasibility study for my new textile venture." That first meeting lasted 2 hours, extending well past my lunch break. Arthur's passion for his business ideas, particularly his innovative approach to sustainable textile manufacturing, was infectious. He explained complex market dynamics with such clarity and enthusiasm that I found myself completely engrossed. "The problem," he confided, leaning across my desk, "is funding. My family's trust is minimal, and banks want proven results before they'll invest." Catch-22, I nodded. You need money to get results, but you need results to get money. His smile transformed his serious face. Exactly. Someone who understands. We began meeting regularly, officially to coordinate the study, unofficially because we simply enjoyed each other's company. 3 months later, we were dating. 6 months after that, Arthur received the devastating news that his initial seed funding was being cut entirely. "What happened?" I asked, seeing his expression. He handed me the letter wordlessly. "The university was redirecting resources to more promising projects," he said bitterly. That night, in my small apartment, we sat surrounded by his business plans and proposals, rejected by 7 different banks. The coffee table disappeared beneath stacks of papers representing years of his work. "This venture could revolutionize the industry," I said, reviewing his meticulous data. "These banks are being short-sighted." Arthur ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as frustration. Without institutional backing, no one will take the risk. Years of research wasted. I watched him, brilliant, dedicated, but defeated in that moment, and thought about my own recent loss. My grandmother had passed away just 2 months earlier, leaving me her life savings. The money sat untouched in my bank account while I contemplated my future. I'd considered buying a small house, investing conservatively, perhaps funding further education. What if we did it ourselves? The words left my mouth before I'd fully formed the thought. Arthur looked up, confusion crossing his features. Did what? Start a textile company? Develop the manufacturing independently? He laughed, then stopped when he saw my expression. Agnes, that would take hundreds of thousands of dollars. 500,000 to be exact, I said quietly. My inheritance from my grandmother. The memory of his face in that moment, shock transforming into disbelief, then cautious hope, remained one of my most treasured. That night, on my secondhand sofa, our hands intertwined. We dreamed about what would become Sterling Ventures. We'll be partners, I said, excitement building as we sketched plans on the back of a pizza delivery menu. Your vision, my funding, and our combined dedication. Arthur grew serious, taking my hands in his. I can't let you risk everything. I believe in you, I said simply. I believe in this venture, and I believe in us. 2 weeks later, he proposed on the rooftop of the old mill where he envisioned his first factory. 2 months after that, we were married in a small ceremony with my parents and his mother in attendance. And by fall, we had incorporated Sterling Ventures, with Arthur as the public face and primary visionary, and me as the silent partner and administrator. The first years were lean and challenging. We worked out of a converted warehouse space, with minimal equipment. Arthur developed his prototypes while I managed the business side, setting up accounting systems, navigating regulatory requirements, and stretching my inheritance to cover each month's expenses. Our breakthrough came in our 3rd year. Arthur's late nights had finally yielded promising results, enough to attract attention in the industry. When Mr. Henderson, a respected corporate attorney nearing retirement, expressed interest in our venture, it felt like divine intervention. He brought industry connections, additional funding, and invaluable mentorship. On a warm evening in 1979, Mr. Henderson invited us to his country club, a place so exclusive I'd felt uncomfortable despite wearing my best dress. Over dinner, he studied us with shrewd eyes. You've got something special here, Mr. Henderson told us, swirling his wine thoughtfully. But you need to think about structure and optics. Later that evening, in Mr. Henderson's wood-paneled home office, he raised concerns that would alter the course of our lives. The business world is still an old boys' club, he said bluntly, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. They'll take a male entrepreneur more seriously, especially with this kind of disruptive technology. That's archaic, I protested. It is, Mr. Henderson agreed. But it's reality. If you want this company to reach its full potential, which should be the ultimate goal, you need to play the game. The game, as Mr. Henderson outlined it, involved restructuring the company with Arthur as the clear head and me in a supporting, albeit influential, role. On paper, my ownership would be reduced, though Mr. Henderson insisted on legal protections written into the bylaws. Never give up control entirely, he advised me privately when Arthur stepped out to take a phone call. Men in this industry can get ambitious, even good men like Arthur. I remember laughing, dismissing his concern. Arthur and I are partners in everything. The paperwork is just for show. Mr. Henderson's expression had remained serious. Humor, an old man who's seen too many partnerships dissolve when money and recognition enter the picture. Let my lawyer draft protection clauses, just in case. I'd agreed, more to ease his mind than from any real concern. The clauses he insisted on, including the critical one converting my shares upon wrongful disinheritance, seemed like unnecessary precautions for a marriage and business partnership as solid as ours. How wrong I had been. How naively trusting. The memory of Mr. Henderson's warning resonated through the years, his voice clear in my mind. Never give up control entirely. Even good men like Arthur can change when money and recognition enter the picture. How prophetic those words had proven to be. The idealistic entrepreneur I'd fallen in love with had gradually transformed into someone I barely recognized. Ambitious, calculating, willing to betray not just his wife but the very principles that had once defined him. Agnes, Benedict's voice pulled me back to the present. The drawing room had settled somewhat, family members returning to their seats with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. I blinked, the bright lights of the modern drawing room replacing the warm glow of Mr. Henderson's study in my mind. "Legal has confirmed the validity of these documents," Benedict said, his tone carefully neutral. "Your conversion of shares appears to be legitimate." Arthur stood ramrod straight at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled anger. "This is a technicality that can be addressed. The disinheritance was part of a larger estate restructuring, not without cause." Mr. Davies shook his head slightly. "The revised will specifically cites a desire for, quote, simplified beneficiary structures as the reason, with no performance issues noted. That constitutes without cause under any reasonable legal standard." "There are 50 years of decisions and agreements to review," Arthur insisted. "This will take weeks to sort out properly." "Actually," I said, checking my watch, "Mr. Davies will be joining us momentarily to address any further legal questions. As the attorney who drafted the original agreements and all subsequent amendments, he can clarify anything that remains unclear." At the mention of Mr. Davies's name, Arthur paled visibly. He knew as well as I did that Mr. Davies's meticulous documentation would leave no room for maneuvering. Felicity leaned over to whisper something in Arthur's ear. He shook his head sharply, then addressed the family. "I suggest we adjourn to consider these developments and reconvene when cooler heads prevail." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," I replied calmly. "Not when there are pressing matters that affect the family's future. Perhaps now would be a good time to discuss the Sterling Foundation's missing funds." The room went utterly still at the mention of the family's most secretive charitable initiative. Arthur's expression confirmed what Mr. Henderson's final letter had warned me about. Something was very wrong with the Sterling Foundation, and only those in the innermost circle knew the truth. The Sterling Manor drawing room fell silent at the mention of the Sterling Foundation's missing funds. The phrase hung in the air, heavier than any legal document, striking at the very heart of the family's public image and their cherished philanthropic endeavors. Arthur's face, which moments ago had been a mask of controlled anger, now paled to an ashen gray. Felicity, ever vigilant, reached for his arm, a gesture both possessive and subtly restraining. "The Sterling Foundation is not relevant to this discussion, Agnes," Arthur finally said, his voice tight, attempting to regain control. "We're discussing ownership shares, not charitable protocols." "They're inseparable," I replied calmly, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the family members. "The Sterling legacy, and indeed its future, depends on both its leadership and its charitable arm being above reproach." Benedict leaned forward, his face etched with concern. "Agnes, what exactly are you implying about the foundation?" Before I could answer, the drawing room door opened, and a distinguished woman with silver hair, Dr. Evelyn Reed, entered, accompanied by Mr. Davies. Evelyn, a former board member of the Sterling Foundation and a renowned ethicist, had abruptly resigned 6 months earlier, citing, quote, unforeseen personal reasons. "Sorry I'm late," Evelyn announced, setting her briefcase on the table. "Traffic was worse than expected. I see you've begun without me." Arthur's face darkened further. "This meeting is for family members and current trust executives only. Dr. Reed is no longer affiliated with the Sterling Foundation." "Actually," I interjected, "as the majority shareholder, I've invited them both to provide context that will help the family understand how we arrived at this moment." The path that had led us here stretched back far beyond my personal discovery of Arthur's betrayal. To truly understand what was happening to the Sterling legacy, the family needed to know its complete history, including the parts that had been carefully hidden from them. "Dr. Reed," I said, nodding to the ethicist, "would you please share with the family why you left the Sterling Foundation 6 months ago?" Evelyn stepped forward, her posture straight despite the tension visible in her shoulders. At 68, she had been one of the most respected figures in the philanthropic world, her presence lending immense credibility to the Sterling Foundation's endeavors. "I was asked to approve modified financial reports for the Foundation's annual audit and its major donor report," she stated firmly. When I refused, I was given the choice to retire with a generous package or be terminated for failure to align with the Foundation's new strategic direction. Murmurs rippled through the drawing room. Benedict looked shocked. "That's an outrageous claim," Arthur snapped. "Dr. Reed had performance issues that were well documented. Her allegations are simply attempts to deflect from her own failings." "Are they?" Mr. Davies opened his briefcase and distributed folders to each family member. "These documents tell a different story." As the family members examined the evidence, I reflected on how we had reached this critical juncture. The family's evolution, both in wealth and influence, had been marked by key moments that, in retrospect, revealed the gradual shift in Arthur's priorities and ethics. Sterling Enterprises hadn't always been the industry leader it was today. After our early years as Sterling Ventures, the rebranding and partnership with Mr. Henderson in 1980 had marked our first major expansion. Mr. Henderson's investment and industry connections had accelerated our growth, allowing us to move from basic textile manufacturing into diversified investments. By 1985, we had established the Sterling Foundation, a testament to our growing success and a commitment to giving back to the community that had supported us. The Foundation's initial charter, co-written by Arthur and me, had emphasized transparent philanthropy and a dedication to education and healthcare initiatives. That year, Arthur and I had purchased Sterling Manor, celebrating with champagne on the empty living room floor, dreaming of the legacy we hoped to build. The company continued to grow steadily until 2000, when a major investment in a tech startup failed, resulting in a significant financial setback. The loss had nearly devastated us, financially and emotionally. I remembered holding Arthur as he grappled with the disappointment, his years of careful investment proving ineffective despite early promising results. "It happens." Mr. Henderson had counseled us over dinner at his home. "Even the best investors face failure. It's how you respond that defines you." Arthur had seemed to take the advice to heart, redoubling his efforts on more promising investment areas. But looking back, I could see that something fundamental had shifted. The entrepreneur who had once been driven by innovation and community impact began focusing more on quarterly returns and maximizing personal wealth. The acquisition of Thorn Capital in 2015 had been our largest expansion, and in hindsight, a turning point. The smaller investment firm had complementary assets, making it an attractive target. But the $120 million purchase price had stretched our resources and increased pressure for immediate returns. It was during the integration of Thorn Capital that Felicity had entered our lives. She had been their head of compliance, a position that put her in frequent contact with Arthur during the transition. I had found her impressive, articulate, knowledgeable, with an energetic presence that enlivened meetings. When Arthur's previous legal assistant retired later that year, I had suggested Felicity for the role. "She's overqualified," Arthur had objected initially. "An executive position at Thorn Capital to an assistant role? It would keep her in the company during the restructuring," I had countered. "And you need someone who understands both organizations during the transition. It could be temporary until we find a better fit for her skills." Arthur had agreed, and Felicity had accepted with apparent gratitude. The temporary arrangement had soon become permanent, with Felicity proving herself indispensable to Arthur. She anticipated his needs, streamlined his communications, and increasingly represented him in internal meetings he was too busy to attend. I had been pleased at first, grateful that Arthur had such competent support during the stressful integration period. I'd even invited Felicity to our home for dinner several times, wanting to make her feel welcomed into the Sterling family. Mr. Henderson, however, had been less impressed. "Watch that one," he had murmured to me at the family holiday party in 2016, nodding toward Felicity as she laughed at something Arthur said. "She's ambitious in ways that aren't always healthy for an organization." I had dismissed his concern as old-fashioned caution. "She's good at her job, Mr. Henderson. Arthur trusts her." "That's what worries me," he had replied, his eyes serious despite his smile. Mr. Henderson's health had begun declining the following year. By 2018, he had stepped back from active involvement in family affairs, though he maintained his position on the trust board. His absence had created a vacuum that Arthur quickly filled, consolidating his authority as head of the family and chairman of Sterling Enterprises. The company had continued its upward trajectory. The Sterling Foundation had emerged from our continued success, growing to a significant endowment by 2020, showing extraordinary promise for impacting educational initiatives in the region. The potential impact was enormous, and the foundation had garnered significant public goodwill based on its early results. When Mr. Henderson passed away last year, his final communication had included a warning that now seemed prophetic. "Never sacrifice integrity for speed," he had told Arthur during a rare private conversation just weeks before his death. "Our responsibility is to the community first, personal gain second." At his funeral, Arthur had delivered a moving eulogy about Mr. Henderson's principles and vision. Less than 6 months later, he had begun dismantling those very principles in pursuit of faster wealth accumulation and personal aggrandizement. Now, in the drawing room, the evidence of that betrayal lay before the shocked family members. Mr. Davies' documents included side-by-side comparisons of the original and modified financial reports for the Sterling Foundation, emails between Arthur and Felicity discussing how to manage the foundation's budget for personal gain, and Dr. Reed's formal objections before her forced retirement. "This is potentially criminal," Clara said finally, looking up from the folder with horror. "If the Charity Commission discovers this manipulation, which they will," Dr. Reed interjected, "when donors start questioning where their money is actually going, and the foundation's assets are a fraction of what's been reported in our public statements." Benedict turned to Arthur, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Is this true? Did you authorize these changes to the foundation's data?" Arthur's face had gone from flushed to ashen. Beside him, Felicity stared straight ahead. Her earlier confidence evaporated. "The modifications were within acceptable accounting parameters," Arthur said finally. "Every large foundation makes judgment calls about how to present financial data." "Not like this," Dr. Reed countered firmly. "This crosses every ethical and legal line in nonprofit finance." I watched my husband, Thor, brilliant entrepreneur I had once invested everything in, attempting to justify actions that violated everything we had once stood for. In that moment, I felt not anger, but profound sadness for how far he had fallen from the idealistic visionary who had once worked tirelessly to build a genuine legacy. "The family needs to understand exactly what's at stake," I said quietly. "These aren't just ethical violations. They threaten the very existence of the Sterling Foundation and the trust that millions of people have placed in our name." The drawing room fell into stunned silence as the family members processed the evidence before them. Benedict looked physically ill, while Robert frantically flipped through the financial implications outlined in the final pages of Mr. Davies' report. "If this fraudulent reporting goes forward, and the Charity Commission later discovers the falsification," Sheila explained, her tone measured but grave, "the Sterling family could face fines potentially exceeding $50 million, not to mention criminal charges against those responsible, and a complete loss of credibility with regulatory agencies worldwide. And the Foundation's future submissions would face extraordinary scrutiny," Dr. Reed added. Arthur remained silent, his earlier defiance replaced by grim calculation. Felicity whispered urgently in his ear, but he shook his head slightly in response. "This is distressing information," Benedict said finally, "but it doesn't explain why you never revealed your ownership stake until now, Agnes. If you knew about these issues, why wait until after your disinheritance to come forward?" It was a fair question, one that deserved a complete answer. The truth was that my value to the Sterling legacy had always been more complex and substantial than anyone realized. I had remained in the shadows by choice, but that time had ended. "My role at Sterling Enterprises has always been deliberately understated," I began. "Most of you know me as the matriarch, overseeing charitable initiatives and public engagement. But that position was merely my official capacity." I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's projection system. The screen displayed a simple organizational chart, showing positions rather than names. "Since our founding, I've served as an internal check and balance, someone who could observe operations from multiple levels without the filters typically placed around executives. I highlighted several positions on the chart. I've had direct access to departments across the organization, from finance to operations to public relations. Robert nodded slowly. You've always had unusual visibility across divisions. I assumed it was because of your marriage to Arthur. Partially, I acknowledged, but it was also by Mr. Henderson's design. He believed family enterprises needed ethical guardians who could see the full picture without departmental biases. I advanced to the next slide, showing a timeline of major family decisions dating back 15 years. In 2008, I identified manufacturing inconsistencies in our overseas factories before they triggered a major recall, I explained, pointing to the first entry. In 2011, I restructured our scholarship program, simultaneously improving access and saving $4.2 million annually. In 2014, I developed our relationship with the Indonesian textile ministry, opening a market that now generates $48 million in annual revenue. Benedict leaned forward, studying the timeline with newfound interest. I remember these initiatives, but they were always presented as team efforts or executive committee decisions. Because that served the company's interests, I replied. My effectiveness depended partly on being underestimated, on being seen as simply Arthur's wife with a ceremonial role. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew better than anyone how strategic my contributions had been, even as he minimized them to others. When the Thorn Capital acquisition was being negotiated, I continued, I identified the hidden liabilities in their secondary portfolio that allowed us to reduce the purchase price by $18 million. Arthur presented the finding to the board, but the research was mine. Several family members exchanged glances. They'd praised Arthur extensively for that particular insight. Most recently, I established our partnership with Meridian Philanthropy Network, giving us access to their donor data platform for charitable initiatives. I highlighted the entry from just 8 months ago. That partnership reduced our fundraising costs by 30% and accelerated our outreach across 5 development programs. Clara nodded. I wondered how that deal came together so quickly. Meridian had previously refused partnerships with 3 other major foundations. Their CEO's daughter benefited from our scholarship program, I explained. The relationship I built through that experience opened doors that would have remained closed to traditional business approaches. I closed the laptop, turning to face the family. My value to Sterling Enterprises and the Sterling Foundation has never been limited to public relations. I've been integral to operations, strategy, and relationships since our founding. Arthur knows this better than anyone. All eyes turned to Arthur, who had the decency to look momentarily abashed before his expression hardened again. Agnes has contributed in various ways over the years, he acknowledged stiffly, but her position was legitimately eliminated in our restructuring plan. The timing may seem convenient, but the decision was based on business needs. Was it? Mr. Davies asked, raising an eyebrow. He displayed a slide showing the internal memo authorizing my disinheritance, dated just 2 days after I had met with Dr. Reed to discuss my concerns about the Foundation's financial manipulation. This timeline suggests the restructuring was hastily planned after Agnes began asking questions about the Sterling Foundation, Mr. Davies observed, not as part of a long-term organizational strategy. Felicity finally spoke up, her voice tightly controlled. These insinuations are inappropriate. Arthur made difficult business decisions for the good of the family. Including your promotion to Vice President of Legal Affairs, I asked quietly. A position created the same day mine was eliminated? Spots of color appeared on Felicity's cheeks. I earned that promotion through years of dedication. No one is questioning your work ethic, Felicity, I replied evenly, but the timing and circumstances merit examination. I turned back to the family members, whose expressions ranged from confusion to growing comprehension. They were beginning to understand the full picture, not just of Arthur's personal betrayal, but of his systematic effort to remove anyone who might interfere with his plans for the Foundation's funds. What many of you don't know is that I've maintained relationships with the staff who actually manage the Sterling Foundation's daily operations, I continued. While Arthur managed the executive aspects, I stayed connected to the people doing the work. I nodded to Dr. Reed, who opened her own laptop and brought up a different set of data. For the past 3 months, I've been working with Dr. Reed and her former team on an alternative approach to address the missing funds and transparently report on the Foundation's actual assets, I explained. Rather than hiding the problem, we've been solving it. Dr. Reed took over, her expertise evident, as she walked the family through the revised financial reports her team had developed, meticulously tracing every diverted dollar and reallocating it back to its intended purpose. We've restored the Foundation's true financial picture while maintaining its core mission, she explained, pointing to comparative charts. These results are preliminary, but promising enough that we could approach the Charity Commission with a transparent amendment to our annual report. The solution was elegant and completely different from Arthur's approach of concealment. This alternative would delay the annual report submission by approximately 6 months, Dr. Reed concluded, but it would result in a fully compliant, ethically sound foundation with no regulatory risks. Benedict turned to Arthur. Why wasn't this approach pursued originally? Arthur's jaw tightened. The delay would have pushed our public relations initiatives into next fiscal year, affecting our fundraising projections and public image. And your performance bonuses from the trust, Robert added quietly, the financial implications becoming clear to the family accountant. You risked the family's reputation, charitable mission, and potentially the entire future of the Sterling legacy for a faster public appearance? Benedict asked, disbelief evident in his voice. I made decisions under tremendous pressure to deliver results. Arthur responded defensively. Every large foundation operates under these constraints. Not like this, Benedict replied firmly. Not at Sterling. Not under Mr. Henderson's principles. I watched the family members' expressions shift as they processed everything they'd learned. My hidden value to the family had always extended far beyond my official title. I had been its ethical compass, its relationship builder, its problem solver. Arthur had known this when he married me, appreciated it for years, then deliberately pushed me aside when my integrity became inconvenient. My disinheritance wasn't just a personal betrayal, I said quietly. It was a strategic removal of the person most likely to expose the Foundation's issues before they reached the Charity Commission. What Arthur hadn't anticipated was that Mr. Henderson's foresight and my preparation had transformed his action from a power move into a catastrophic miscalculation, one that had now exposed everything he had tried to hide. As the gravity of the situation settled over the drawing room, Arthur appeared to recalculate his position. His initial shock had given way to a more measured demeanor, the negotiator emerging from the defeated executive. These are serious allegations that deserve proper investigation, he said, his voice regaining some confidence. But right now, we're in the middle of a critical public relations campaign. Any disruption could destroy years of work and millions in donor investment. He turned to face the family members directly. I propose we table this discussion, continue with the current Foundation timeline, and form a committee to investigate these claims thoroughly. After the public report, we can submit amendments if necessary. It was a calculated appeal to financial interests, prioritizing short-term public image over ethical concerns. I watched several family members consider his proposal, their expressions revealing the internal conflict between family responsibility and reputation. This was precisely the moment I had prepared for in the week since discovering Arthur's betrayal. My response had not been emotional or impulsive, but carefully orchestrated to address exactly this scenario. That approach would compound the legal exposure rather than mitigate it, I said calmly. Fortunately, I've developed an alternative strategy. I nodded to Mr. Davies, who distributed another set of documents to the family members. What you're receiving is a comprehensive transition plan, I explained. It includes 3 key components. First, a voluntary disclosure to the Charity Commission regarding the Foundation's financial issues. Second, submission of Dr. Reed's modified reports as an amendment to the current annual filing. And third, a leadership restructuring to ensure proper oversight moving forward. The family members flipped through the detailed proposal, 38 pages of precisely outlined steps, timelines, and contingencies. "You prepared all this since yesterday?" Benedict asked, clearly impressed by the thoroughness. "No," I admitted. "I've been developing this plan for 6 weeks. Ever since I confirmed the data manipulation, my disinheritance was actually the trigger I needed to implement it." Arthur looked stunned. "You planned for your own removal?" For the first time that morning, I allowed myself a small smile. I anticipated it. There's a difference. In truth, the preparation had begun the very night I overheard Arthur and Felicity discussing the modified financial data. Instead of confronting them immediately, which would have allowed time for evidence to disappear, I had methodically built my case and prepared for multiple scenarios. First, I had secured the original foundation financial data, creating multiple encrypted backups stored in locations Arthur couldn't access. Then, I had reached out to Dr. Reed, arranging our first discreet meeting at a coffee shop 20 minutes from Sterling Manor. "I need to understand what really happened with your departure," I had told her, careful to speak quietly despite the bustling cafe around us. The relief on her face had been palpable as she realized someone finally wanted the truth. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she'd replied, pulling out a notebook filled with meticulous documentation of the changes she'd been asked to approve. Over the following weeks, we had assembled a small, trusted team of former Foundation staff who had worked on the original reports from the beginning, meeting in evenings and on weekends away from Arthur's offices. They had developed and tested the modified financial statements that addressed the missing funds and realigned with ethical accounting practices. Simultaneously, I had consulted with Mr. Davies about the legal implications of both the financial falsification and my ownership stake. Together, we had crafted a strategy that would protect the family legacy while ensuring accountability. "Your plan assumes you have the authority to implement it," Arthur pointed out, studying the document with growing concern. "The family board would need to approve such drastic changes." "As majority shareholder, I can call for votes on each element," I replied. "But I'd prefer the family recognize the wisdom of this approach and support it voluntarily." I turned to Benedict. "The plan protects Sterling's long-term interests. Yes, it will impact this quarter's public image and likely our financial liquidity in the short term, but it preserves the family's reputation, prevents regulatory penalties, and most importantly, ensures the integrity of the Sterling Foundation's mission." Benedict studied the proposal thoughtfully. "The voluntary disclosure approach is risky. The Charity Commission could still impose penalties." "They could," Mr. Davies acknowledged, "but our legal analysis suggests they would be substantially reduced compared to penalties imposed after the agency discovers the issues independently. The good faith disclosure creates a significant mitigating factor." "And the leadership restructuring?" Clara asked, eyeing the section that addressed executive changes. "This is quite extensive. It addresses not just the immediate issues, but the cultural factors that allowed them to develop," I explained. "A comprehensive approach is necessary to prevent similar problems in the future." The restructuring plan called for Arthur's removal as head of the Sterling Family Trust, the formation of an ethics oversight committee with direct board reporting lines, and a thorough review of all executive decisions made during the past 18 months. Robert, ever focused on financial implications, raised the most pressing concern. "What about our public image? This will trigger significant public backlash when it becomes public." "That's addressed on page 24, I replied. "We've developed a communication strategy that emphasizes the long-term benefits of transparency and our proactive approach to addressing the issues. Additionally, I'm prepared to use my personal resources to establish a fund to stabilize the Foundation's assets if necessary." My willingness to back the plan financially seemed to surprise several family members. It underscored that my commitment wasn't just to my own interests, but to the family's survival and ethical restoration. Throughout the discussion, Felicity had grown, increasingly agitated, whispering urgently to Arthur and typing frantically on her tablet. "Finally," she interrupted. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "Arthur has led this family to record profits for 5 consecutive quarters. This entire presentation is nothing but a vindictive response to personal issues." Her characterization hung in the air for a moment before I responded. Personal issues didn't falsify financial data, I said quietly. Personal issues didn't force out Foundation members who raised concerns. And personal issues didn't jeopardize the Sterling Foundation's mission for the sake of faster public acclaim. I stood, addressing the family directly. I understand this is overwhelming. You're being asked to choose between continuing a comfortable but dangerous path, or taking a difficult but principled stand. I paused, looking each member in the eye. Mr. Henderson built this family's legacy on the belief that doing right by the community would ultimately do right by the family. I'm asking you to honor that legacy. Benedict looked down at the proposal again, then at Arthur, his expression troubled. 50 years of friendship warring with his responsibility as head of the family. Arthur, he said finally, would you and Felicity step out for a few minutes? The family needs to discuss this privately. Arthur rose slowly, his expression unreadable. Before you make any decisions, remember that I've devoted my life to this family. Everything I've done has been to ensure its success. Including disinheriting your wife and manipulating charitable funds? Benedict asked quietly. Arthur had no answer for that. He and Felicity left the room in silence, the door closing firmly behind them. Once they were gone, Benedict turned to me. You could have revealed all this the moment you discovered it. Why wait until now? Why let yourself be disinherited first? The question cut to the heart of my strategy. Why I had allowed events to unfold as they had instead of confronting Arthur immediately. Because exposing the issues without having solutions in place would have damaged the Sterling legacy beyond repair, I answered honestly. I needed time to secure the evidence, develop the alternative financial reports, and prepare the transition plan. And most importantly, I needed Arthur to take an action that would trigger the share conversion clause, giving me the authority to implement these changes. It had been a calculated risk, letting Arthur believe he was removing an obstacle, while actually giving me the very power I needed to save the family from his compromised leadership. You sacrificed yourself to save Sterling, Clara said with newfound respect. Not sacrificed, I corrected her. Strategically positioned. There's a difference. As the family began their private deliberations, I stepped out into the hallway with Mr. Davies and Dr. Reed. The manor felt eerily quiet. Word of the emergency meeting had spread, and most staff were keeping their distance, unsure of what was unfolding in the drawing room. Arthur and Felicity were nowhere to be seen, likely retreated to his study to develop their counter-strategy. For the moment we had a brief respite to gather our thoughts. You did well in there, Mr. Davies said, squeezing my arm gently. They're listening. Dr. Reed nodded in agreement. Benedict's face when he saw the original data. I don't think he had any idea how severe the manipulation was. I leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 6 weeks. The strain of maintaining appearances while gathering evidence. The sleepless nights developing the transition plan. The emotional toll of watching my marriage crumble while fighting to save the legacy we'd built. It all crashed over me at once. I couldn't have done this alone, I said quietly. Not any of it. And it was true. While Arthur had been systematically isolating me professionally, I had been building a network of allies who shared my concerns about the Sterling family's direction. People whose loyalty was to the family's mission, rather than to Arthur personally. Dr. Reed had been the first, providing crucial ethical expertise and access to the former Foundation staff who had worked on the original reports. Mr. Davies had been my legal lifeline, helping navigate the complex implications of Arthur's actions and my ownership stake. But there were others who had formed my support system during this crisis. My thoughts turned to young Sarah from the IT department, who had come to my private study 3 months ago, visibly distressed after being instructed to prepare materials that overstated the Foundation's reach while minimizing its actual financial activity. I don't feel right about this, Agnes, she had confided, but I was told the directives came straight from Arthur, and questioning them would be unwise. Instead of dismissing her concerns, I had listened carefully, asking her to document the specific requests and forward them to me for coordination purposes. Those documents now formed part of the evidence, showing the systematic nature of the deception. Then there was Marcus, from accounting, a veteran employee who had been with Sterling Enterprises since the early days. He had approached me at a family picnic last month, carefully steering me away from the crowd. There are inconsistencies in the foundation's budget projections, he had said in a low voice. Data that doesn't match what I saw in preliminary reports. When I raised questions, Felicity intervened and said she would handle all foundation-related communications personally. His testimony, recorded discreetly in Mr. Davies's office, provided crucial context about how normal oversight channels had been circumvented. Even Robert, though officially part of the family board, had subtly aided my efforts. After our quarterly budget review meeting, he had lingered behind, closing the door before speaking. The financial projections for the foundation seem overly optimistic, he had observed carefully, and the contingency reserves for potential adverse events have been reduced below our standard protocols. His willingness to highlight these discrepancies, however obliquely, had helped me track the paper trail of decisions leading to the current crisis. Agnes? Mr. Davies' voice pulled me back to the present. Are you all right? I nodded, straightening my posture. Just thinking about everyone who helped us get here. Their courage made this possible. Mr. Henderson would be proud, Dr. Reed said softly. He always said you were the heart of Sterling, the one who truly understood what the family was meant to be. Mr. Henderson. His absence felt particularly acute today. He had been more than a mentor to me. He had become a second father, guiding my development as a business leader, while Arthur focused increasingly on external recognition. Our monthly dinners, continued even after his official retirement, had been filled with discussions about philanthropic ethics, leadership challenges, and the future of responsible wealth management. Mr. Henderson had seen the changes in Arthur before I had allowed myself to recognize them. Power reveals character. It doesn't change it, he had told me during our last dinner together, just weeks before his death. Arthur's ambition was always there, Agnes. It was once tempered by your influence and my oversight. I worry about what happens when those guardrails are gone. At the time, I had defended Arthur, attributing Mr. Henderson's concerns to the natural caution of age. Now I recognized the wisdom in his warning and his foresight in ensuring I would have the legal protections I needed when the moment of crisis arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Benedict, "Family ready for you now." As we turned to re-enter the drawing room, we encountered Arthur and Felicity coming down the hallway. Arthur's expression was grim determination. Felicity's, barely controlled panic. "The family has requested we all return," I said neutrally. Arthur nodded stiffly. "This isn't over, Agnes. You may have planned this ambush well, but there are aspects of the situation you haven't considered." "I've considered more than you realize," I replied quietly, "including what happens after today's decision." For a moment, standing face to face with the man I had loved for 50 years, I felt a flicker of the connection that had once bound us together, brilliant young professionals with shared dreams and values. When had we diverged so completely? At what point had Arthur decided that success justified any means necessary to achieve it? The door to the drawing room opened, and Benedict beckoned us inside. The moment for reflection had passed. Now we would face whatever decision the family had reached. As we took our seats, I noted that the family members' expressions had shifted. The shock and confusion from earlier had been replaced by a collective resolve. Benedict, in particular, seemed to have aged years in the past hour, the weight of his responsibility evident in the deep lines around his eyes. "We've reviewed the evidence and discussed the options thoroughly," he began, his voice steady despite the tension. "This is, without question, the most difficult situation our family board has faced." He turned to Arthur. "We've also heard your perspective on the Foundation's data and the decisions you made regarding its presentation to the Charity Commission." Arthur straightened in his chair. "I maintain that my actions were within acceptable industry parameters and in the family's best interests." Benedict shook his head slightly. "The family disagrees. The manipulation of charitable funds crosses ethical and legal boundaries that Sterling has always respected, even when competitors did not. It was Mr. Henderson's founding principle that our philanthropy would stand on its genuine merits, not marketing spin or selective data presentation." Felicity started to interject, but Benedict raised his hand to silence her. "As for the disinheritance of Agnes Sterling," he continued, "the family board finds that it was executed without proper cause or consultation, apparently motivated by personal conflicts, and the desire to remove oversight of the Foundation's processes. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Therefore, Benedict said, his gaze sweeping the room, the family board acknowledges Agnes Sterling's conversion of shares to voting status as valid under the terms of the original agreements. As majority shareholder, she has the authority to direct the family's immediate actions regarding both the Sterling Foundation and its leadership structure. It was as definitive a victory as I could have hoped for, validation not just of my legal position, but of my ethical concerns as well. Yet I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of responsibility for what came next. The family further recommends, Benedict continued, that we implement the transition plan Agnes has presented, with certain modifications to timing and public communications that we've outlined here. He slid a document across the table to me. I scanned the annotations quickly. Minor adjustments that preserved the core elements while accelerating the Charity Commission disclosure and adding more detailed shareholder communications. The family had not only accepted my plan but strengthened it. "Thank you," I said, looking up at the assembled family members. "I accept these recommendations and am prepared to begin implementation immediately." Arthur's expression had gone completely blank, the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to concealing his thoughts in high-stakes negotiations. But Felicity was less controlled, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. "You can't possibly expect this transition to be successful," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "Arthur built relationships with donors, investors, regulators. They trust him, not you." I met her gaze steadily. "Those relationships were built on Sterling's reputation for integrity, a reputation we're now fighting to preserve. And contrary to what you might believe, many of those connections were actually my work, not Arthur's." The personal dynamics that had brought us to this point, the affair, the betrayal, the planned engagement announcement, suddenly seemed secondary to the larger issues at stake. This wasn't about my marriage anymore. It was about the future of the Sterling legacy and the community that depended on our philanthropy. "What happens now?" Arthur asked, his voice carefully neutral. Benedict answered before I could. "The family board will announce your resignation as head of the Sterling Family Trust, effective immediately." "Resignation?" Arthur's voice was dangerously quiet. The controlled facade he had maintained throughout the meeting finally cracked, revealing the anger beneath. "After 50 years, you expect me to simply walk away?" "Not empty-handed," Benedict clarified. "The severance package is generous considering the circumstances." Mr. Davies slid a folder across the table. Arthur made no move to take it, his eyes fixed on Benedict, with an intensity that made several family members shift uncomfortably. "I built this family's fortune," he said, each word precise and clipped. "From a small venture to a global enterprise, and you're casting me aside based on one person's accusations?" "Based on documented evidence," Benedict corrected firmly. "From multiple sources. Evidence curated by my wife during a family dispute," Arthur countered, a hint of desperation entering his voice. He turned to the other family members. "Can't you see what's happening? This is a personal vendetta disguised as corporate concern." I remained silent, allowing the family to respond. Arthur's attempt to reframe the situation as a marital dispute, rather than an ethical breach, was predictable and ultimately futile, given the extensive documentation. "The evidence stands on its own merits," Robert stated flatly. "The financial implications of the Foundation's data manipulation are clearly documented and impossible to ignore." Arthur changed tactics, his expression softening as he addressed the family. "We've worked together for years. You know my commitment to Sterling. If there were oversights in the Foundation's processes, they were made in service to the family's growth. Let me correct them. I can personally oversee a revised submission." Several family members exchanged glances, and I sensed a momentary wavering. Arthur's persuasive abilities had always been formidable. His talent for presenting himself as the indispensable visionary had carried him through previous controversies. Felicity seized the opening. The succession plan requires at least 6 months of transition, she noted, flipping through the family bylaws on her tablet. An immediate resignation would destabilize operations and violate our governance structure. It was a clever angle, using Sterling's own protocols as a shield. For a moment I saw uncertainty flicker across Benedict's face, but Mr. Davies was prepared. The bylaws provide an exception in cases of ethical breaches, he countered smoothly. Section 18, paragraph 4 specifically addresses leadership transitions when integrity issues are involved. Felicity's expression tightened. She hadn't anticipated Mr. Davies's encyclopedic knowledge of the governance documents he himself had drafted decades earlier. Arthur changed tactics again, turning to address me directly for the first time. "Agnes," he said, his tone softening to the one he'd used countless times during our marriage when trying to resolve a disagreement. "We built this together. Whatever personal issues have come between us, destroying everything we've created isn't the answer." It was a masterful attempt at emotional manipulation, invoking our shared history to bypass the ethical issues at hand. For a fleeting moment, I felt the pull of 50 years of partnership, remembered the idealistic young entrepreneur who had once valued truth above all else. "This isn't about destroying what we built," I replied quietly. "It's about preserving it." The Arthur I married would never have compromised the Foundation's mission for personal gain or public accolades. Something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps recognition, perhaps regret. But it vanished quickly, replaced by calculation. "If you force this," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear, "I'll fight it with everything I have. The disclosure will be public, our personal issues will be exposed, your inheritance, our history, all of it will become fodder for society gossip and industry blogs." It was his final card. The threat of mutually assured destruction. A messy public battle that would damage the Sterling legacy regardless of who ultimately prevailed. Before I could respond, the drawing room door burst open. A young woman from the IT department, Sarah, I recalled, entered with a tablet in hand, her expression urgent. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing nervously around the room, "but there's something the family needs to see immediately." Benedict frowned at the interruption. "We're in the middle of a critical meeting." "I know, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steadying with resolve. "But someone is attempting to delete server files related to the Sterling Foundation. The system flagged it as unusual activity because it's accessing archived financial data from multiple secure directories simultaneously." All eyes turned to Felicity, whose tablet was still open before her. Her fingers froze above the screen, color draining from her face. "The deletion commands are coming from an executive access point," Sarah continued, glancing at Felicity's tablet. "The system log shows the credentials being used belong to." She paused, checking her notes. "Felicity Thorne." The room fell silent. Felicity's unauthorized attempt to delete evidence during the family meeting itself was a devastating development, one that transformed any lingering doubts into certainty. "Is the data being preserved?" Clara asked sharply. Sarah nodded. "Our security protocols flag and halt unusual mass deletions. I've locked the relevant directories pending leadership authorization, but I thought the family should know immediately." "Thank you, Sarah," Benedict said, his expression grim. "You did exactly the right thing." As Sarah left, closing the door behind her, Felicity looked desperately to Arthur. "I was just securing sensitive information," she attempted weakly. "Standard protocol during leadership transitions." "By deleting original financial data?" Dr. Reed asked incredulously. "There's no legitimate reason to remove those files." Arthur's expression had hardened into something I'd never seen before. Cold fury mixed with the realization that his position had become untenable. His eyes darted around the room, assessing and discarding options with the rapid calculation that had made him so successful in business negotiations. Finally, he stood abruptly. "I won't be subjected to this kangaroo court. If the family has made its decision, so be it. But this isn't over." He turned to leave, but Benedict's voice stopped him. "Arthur, your resignation letter. The press release goes out in 1 hour." For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Instead, he returned to the table, scrolled his signature on the document Mr. Davies prepared, and pushed it back across the surface with enough force that it slid off the edge. Without another word, he strode from the room, Felicity hurrying after him. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the drawing room visibly eased. Several members exhaled audibly, as if they'd been holding their breath throughout the confrontation. "That could have gone worse," Robert observed dryly. "It still might," Mr. Davies cautioned. "Arthur won't surrender control without a fight." The attempted data deletion was likely just the first countermove. He was right. Arthur was resourceful, connected, and now cornered. A dangerous combination. His parting words hadn't been empty threats. They'd been a declaration of intent. Benedict turned to me, his expression troubled. "What do you think he'll do?" I considered the question carefully. I had known Arthur for 50 years, had loved him, worked alongside him, watched his transformation from idealistic entrepreneur to compromised patriarch. If anyone could anticipate his next move, it would be me. "He'll try to rally support from major shareholders and influential family members," I said finally. "Present himself as the visionary being ousted by bureaucrats who don't understand the realities of running a modern enterprise. He has close relationships with several institutional investors who might be persuaded to pressure the board." "And Felicity?" Clara asked. "She'll focus on damage control," I replied, reaching out to contacts in regulatory affairs, attempting to control the narrative about the Foundation's data. Her network in the industry isn't as extensive as Arthur's, but she's built strategic relationships over the past few years. "We need to move quickly then," Benedict decided. "Implement the transition plan immediately, beginning with the Charity Commission disclosure and the press announcement about leadership changes." As the family board began discussing implementation details, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced down discreetly. "You've won the battle, but not the war. Check your home security system." A chill settled in my stomach. The threat was clear. Arthur was escalating beyond professional retaliation to personal intimidation. The man I had married, the man with whom I had hoped to build a lasting legacy, was now threatening me directly. I showed the message to Mr. Davies, whose expression darkened. "We should contact the police," he murmured. "Not yet," I replied quietly. "Let's see what he's actually done first." Whatever Arthur was planning, I needed to be prepared. The confrontation was moving beyond the drawing room to a more personal battlefield, and the stakes were escalating from family reputation to potentially my safety. The family meeting continued, focusing now on implementing the transition plan. I tried to concentrate on the discussion, but Arthur's threatening text kept pulling my attention away. What had he done to our home? Was it merely an intimidation tactic or something more concrete? "Agnes?" Benedict's voice broke through my distraction. "We were discussing the press release language. Do you have a preference on how your role is described?" I refocused on the matter at hand. "Let's keep it simple and forward-looking. Agnes Sterling, co-founder and majority shareholder, will assume the role of interim head of the Sterling Family Trust, while a search committee identifies a permanent successor." "Not interested in the permanent position?" Robert asked, surprised. "My priority is stabilizing Sterling and addressing the Foundation's issues," I replied. "Long-term leadership decisions can wait until we've navigated the immediate crisis." As the discussion continued, Mr. Davies quietly excused himself, stepping into the hallway with his phone. When he returned a few minutes later, he gave me a subtle nod that suggested he had taken some action regarding Arthur's threat, likely contacting security or perhaps the police. Despite my hesitation, the meeting progressed efficiently, with assignments distributed and a timeline established for the critical next steps. The Charity Commission disclosure would happen immediately, led by Dr. Reed and the original Foundation team. The shareholder communication would follow within hours, explaining both the leadership change and the proactive approach to the Foundation's issues. As we wrapped up the formal proceedings, Benedict asked everyone except me to leave for a moment. When the room had cleared, he sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. "I've known Arthur for nearly 3 decades, he said quietly. "Played golf with him, vacationed with our families, watched him build this company from nothing. I never imagined he could compromise his principles so completely." "Neither did I admitted. The change was gradual, so subtle that I made excuses for each small ethical lapse, until suddenly they weren't small anymore." Benedict nodded solemnly. "Mr. Henderson saw it happening. About a year before he died, he told me to watch the paperwork. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. He was referring to the protection clauses, I realized. He knew Arthur might try to remove me someday. Mr. Henderson was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, Benedict agreed. He hesitated, then added, "There's something you should know. When Mr. Henderson first approached me about becoming chairman of the family board, he insisted on one condition I never fully understood until today. He withdrew an envelope from his suit jacket, the paper yellowed with age. He asked me to keep this in my personal safe, to be opened only if there was ever a fundamental conflict between you and Arthur over the family's direction." My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the envelope. The seal had already been broken. Benedict had obviously read the contents earlier today. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Mr. Henderson's distinctive handwriting. "To the chairman of the Sterling Family Board. If you are reading this, the situation I hoped would never arise has occurred. Arthur and Agnes are at odds over the family's fundamental direction or ethics. Arthur is brilliant, visionary, and capable of extraordinary achievements. But his ambition has always been his vulnerability. I have watched with concern as his decisions increasingly prioritize growth and recognition over the careful, patient building that built our reputation. Agnes is the family's conscience, its ethical compass. She has been the silent force behind many of our most important initiatives, often without recognition or credit. Her judgment in matters of corporate responsibility has been unfailingly sound. The legal protections I insisted upon for her ownership stake were not mere technicalities, but essential safeguards for the family's soul. If these protections have been activated, it is because they were necessary. My final directive as a founder: in any conflict between profit and principle, Sterling must choose principle. The protections built into Agnes's ownership agreement ensure this choice remains possible, regardless of who holds the title of CEO. Trust her judgment. She was my finest investment, Thomas Henderson." Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Mr. Henderson's faith in me, expressed so clearly in words he'd never shared directly, felt like a posthumous embrace, a validation of the difficult path I'd chosen. "He left similar letters with Mr. Davies and the family archivist," Benedict explained. "He created a network of safeguards to protect what he valued most about Sterling, its integrity." I carefully refolded the letter. "I'll never know if I live up to his expectations, but I'll spend every day trying." "You already have," Benedict assured me. He hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been troubling him. "Those protection clauses, the ones that converted your shares upon disinheritance, did Mr. Henderson tell you they existed?" I nodded. "He insisted on them from the beginning, though I never believed they'd be necessary. The final revision was completed just 3 months before he died. He added language specifically addressing disinheritance disguised as restructuring." "As if he foresaw exactly what would happen," Benedict marveled. "I think he simply understood human nature," I replied, "and he'd seen similar scenarios play out at other companies over his long career." There was a knock at the door, and Mr. Davies entered with an update. "I've sent security to your home," he said without preamble. "They found evidence of tampering with your home office. Files missing, computer accessed. The security system had been disabled using Arthur's code." My heart sank. The threat hadn't been empty after all. He was looking for something specific, I guessed, probably evidence related to the foundation or the ownership agreements. "Most likely," Mr. Davies agreed, "but we secured the critical documents weeks ago. Everything important is either with me or in safe deposit boxes." This was the advantage of having anticipated Arthur's moves. We had protected the critical evidence long before he realized its importance. The ownership agreements, the original foundation financial data, Mr. Henderson's letters, all had been secured through Mr. Davies' careful planning. "Should we press charges?" Benedict asked grimly. I considered the question carefully. A criminal complaint would further damage Arthur's reputation and potentially offer additional leverage in negotiations, but it would also escalate the conflict and generate exactly the kind of publicity Arthur had threatened to create. "Not yet," I decided. "Let's focus on stabilizing the family and the foundation first. We can address Arthur's actions once the transition is secure. Mr. Davies nodded approvingly. Strategic as always. Arthur will expect immediate retaliation. When it doesn't come, he'll be off balance, wondering what you're planning instead. As we prepared to join the others, I reflected on the critical detail that had changed everything. The protection clause that Mr. Henderson had insisted upon decades earlier, it had seemed like an unnecessary precaution at the time, a formal legal requirement with little practical relevance to our lives. How wrong I had been. That single clause, hidden within hundreds of pages of corporate documentation, had proven to be the foundation of everything that followed. Without it, Arthur's plan to remove me would have succeeded. Sterling would be proceeding with fraudulent financial reporting. The community would be at risk, and the family's future would be compromised by shortcuts and ethical breaches. Mr. Henderson had understood something fundamental that I had missed in my trust and optimism. Systems, not individuals, ultimately safeguard principles. His insistence on embedding ethical protections into the legal structure of Sterling had created a fail-safe that activated precisely when needed. As we walked out to face the waiting family members, I silently thanked Mr. Henderson for his foresight. The journey ahead would be challenging. Rebuilding the foundation's integrity, addressing the financial issues transparently, managing the inevitable public scrutiny, and navigating the personal aftermath of my collapsed marriage. But thanks to one critical detail in a decades-old agreement, I had the authority to ensure that journey would be guided by the principles upon which Sterling had been founded. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The Charity Commission disclosure was drafted, reviewed by legal, and submitted. The press release announcing Arthur's resignation and my interim appointment was distributed to major news outlets. Key family members and institutional investors received personal calls from Benedict, explaining the situation in carefully measured terms. By early evening, I was exhausted, but knew the most difficult conversations still lay ahead. I had to face Arthur directly, away from the family board and corporate politics. Our 50-year marriage deserved at least that much. A private reckoning before the public storm fully broke. I arranged to meet him at Sterling Manor at 8 p.m. Mr. Davies strongly objected, concerned about my safety after the break-in. At least let security wait outside, he insisted as we stood in my newly appointed interim head office, formerly Arthur's study, now hastily cleared of his personal items. No, I replied firmly. This needs to be completely private, but I'll keep my phone on with the emergency contact ready. He reluctantly agreed, making me promise to check in every 30 minutes. As I drove home in the fading evening light, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. Just yesterday, I had been the quietly sidelined matriarch, officially disinherited and clearing out my personal affairs. Now I was interim head of the Sterling Family Trust, majority shareholder, and the public face of Sterling's ethical recommitment. The house looked exactly as I had left it that morning, though I knew from security's report that Arthur had been inside, searching through my files. I parked in the driveway rather than the garage, ensuring my car would be visible from the street, a small precaution that Mr. Davies would approve of. Arthur arrived precisely at 8 p.m., driving the sleek black Bentley he'd purchased. After the Thorn Capital acquisition, always punctual, even for difficult conversations. Some habits remained unchanged despite everything else that had shifted between us. He didn't use his key but rang the doorbell like a visitor. When I opened the door, the strain of the day was evident on his face. Deeper lines around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth that I recognized from previous professional setbacks. "May I come in?" he asked formally, as if entering a stranger's home. I stepped aside wordlessly. He walked to the living room, taking in the familiar surroundings with an expression I couldn't quite read. Nostalgia, perhaps, or calculation. "Would you like a drink?" I offered, maintaining the strange civility between us. "No," he remained standing, refusing the pretense of casual conversation. "I came because you requested it, but I have nothing to say that wasn't already said in the drawing room." "I thought you might have questions," I said, taking a seat on the sofa. "About what happens next?" "You've made that abundantly clear," he replied, his voice cold. "My resignation has been announced, my access revoked, my legacy tarnished. 50 years dismantled in an afternoon. Just as you planned to do to me, I observed quietly. He didn't deny it. Business decisions require difficult choices. You understood that once. I still do, I countered. But there's a line between difficult choices and ethical breaches. The Foundation's financial manipulation crossed that line. Arthur paced the room, agitation breaking through his controlled facade. The Charity Commission submission would have succeeded. The accounting adjustments were manageable. The community would have benefited from faster access to funding for vital projects. The community deserves informed consent based on accurate data, I replied. You know that, Arthur. You used to be the one insisting on complete transparency in all our dealings. He stopped pacing, turning to face me directly. What do you want from me, Agnes? An apology? Congratulations on your coup? What? I met his gaze steadily. I want to understand when it changed for you. When did results become more important than how we achieved them? Something flickered in his eyes. A moment of genuine reflection before the defenses rose again. It was gradual, he admitted finally, after the tech startup failure in 2000. When I watched 7 years of work amount to nothing because we were too cautious in our investment, while competitors took shortcuts and got to market first. The pain in his voice was real. That failure had devastated him professionally and personally. I remembered holding him through sleepless nights as he grappled with the disappointment. And Felicity? I asked, the question I'd avoided through all the corporate maneuvering. When did that begin? His expression hardened. That's personal, not business. It became business the moment you planned to announce your engagement at a family meeting, I pointed out. The same day you disinherited me. He had the grace to look momentarily ashamed. That was poorly handled. Yes, I agreed. Simply, it was. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. 50 years of shared history hanging in the balance. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The garden lights automatically illuminating the pathway I had designed when we first bought the house. What do you want, Arthur? I asked finally. Beyond recriminations and blame, what outcome are you hoping for now? He seemed startled by the question, as if he hadn't considered options beyond fighting my takeover. For a moment, vulnerability replaced calculation in his expression. I want my legacy intact, he answered with unexpected honesty. I built Sterling from nothing. Whatever mistakes I've made recently don't erase 2 decades of achievements. It was the opening I had been waiting for. The moment when Arthur's personal pride might allow for a resolution that didn't destroy everything we'd both worked to build. Then perhaps, I said carefully, we can find a path forward that preserves what matters most to both of us. Arthur's expression shifted, suspicion replacing vulnerability. What kind of path forward? I gestured for him to sit. After a moment's hesitation, he took the armchair across from me, the same chair where he had sat countless evenings reviewing business plans while I worked on community outreach plans beside him on the sofa. The Charity Commission has already been notified about the Foundation's financial issues, I began. That can't be undone. But how the story unfolds from here, that we can still influence. You want to control the narrative, he observed, professional interest momentarily overriding his anger. I want to protect what's worth protecting, I corrected. Sterling's reputation for integrity can be restored. Your legacy as an entrepreneur and founder can be preserved, separate from recent mistakes. Arthur studied me carefully, trying to discern the trap he suspected. At what cost? Your full cooperation with the Charity Commission investigation, I replied. Complete transparency about how and why the data was modified. No attempt to shift blame to lower-level staff or accounting personnel. His eyes narrowed. You're asking me to fall on my sword. I'm asking you to take responsibility for your actions, I countered. There's a difference. And in return, the family acknowledges your 50 years of contributions in all communications. Your business achievements remain highlighted in company materials. You retain the title of Founder Emeritus, and we establish a new philanthropic initiative in your name for business ethics studies. It was more than a token offer. It was a chance for Arthur to salvage his professional reputation, even as his management ethics were questioned. The Arthur who had once prioritized ethical business practices above all else might recognize the value of such a compromise. He was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal against his alternatives. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. The likelihood of successfully fighting the family board, the potential damage of a protracted public battle, the impact on his future in the industry. "And what about us?" he asked finally. 50 years of marriage dismissed as collateral damage? The question caught me off guard. Throughout the day's events, I had focused entirely on the corporate dimensions of Arthur's betrayal, compartmentalizing the personal heartbreak of his affair with Felicity. "I don't see a path forward for our marriage," I said quietly. "Not after everything that's happened." He nodded slightly, as if he'd expected the answer but needed to hear it directly. "And Felicity?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Her actions regarding the data deletion attempt are documented. Her future at Sterling is untenable," I replied. "Beyond that, your personal relationship with her is not my concern." Arthur leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time since the confrontation began, his defensive posture softened slightly. When he spoke again, his tone had lost some of its edge. "I should have known Mr. Henderson would have protected you legally," he said. "He always saw potential in you that others missed, including you," I observed. Arthur didn't deny it. "I came to see your community work as peripheral to the real business of wealth management. I was wrong." The admission, however small, surprised me. Arthur rarely acknowledged mistakes, even in private. The Indonesian Textile Ministry partnership alone brought in nearly $50 million in revenue last year, I pointed out. "Hardly peripheral." "I know," he acknowledged. "I took credit for that in my presentation to the Barton Investment Group last quarter." The casual admission of how he had appropriated my work stung, even after everything else that had happened, but it also confirmed what I had long suspected. Arthur had been systematically minimizing my contributions while highlighting his own. "Your phone's buzzing," Arthur noted, gesturing to my handbag. I checked it quickly, a text from Mr. Davies asking if I was all right. I sent a brief reply confirming I was fine. "Your watchdog checking in?" Arthur asked, with a hint of his old sarcasm. "Just someone who cares about my well-being," I replied evenly. "Something you seem to have forgotten about recently." He had the grace to look momentarily abashed. "I never intended to harm you personally, Agnes. The disinheritance was business, not—" "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't pretend that disinheriting me while planning to announce your engagement to Felicity wasn't designed to humiliate me. You could have handled things a dozen different ways if you'd wanted to be humane." Arthur fell silent, unable to defend the indefensible. Outside, a car door slammed, and we both tensed, the momentary détente broken by the reminder that others were involved in our conflict. "That's probably Felicity," Arthur said, checking his watch. "I told her I'd call after we spoke." The mention of Felicity's name shifted the atmosphere in the room. Whatever brief connection we had re-established dissolved, replaced by the reality of the triangle we now formed. "You should consider my offer," I said, standing to indicate our conversation was ending. "It's more generous than most family boards would approve under the circumstances." Arthur rose as well, maintaining the careful distance between us. "I'll need to review it with my attorney." "Of course," I agreed. "Mr. Davies will send the formal proposal tomorrow." As we walked to the door, Arthur paused, looking around the home we had shared for so many years. "What will you do with the house?" "I haven't decided," I answered honestly. "There are too many memories here, both good and bad." He nodded, understanding what I meant. For a moment, I glimpsed the man I had married, thoughtful, perceptive, capable of empathy. It made the contrast with who he had become all the more painful. "Mr. Henderson would be proud of you," Arthur said unexpectedly as he stepped onto the porch. "Standing your ground, protecting the family, even at a personal cost." Before I could respond, he turned and walked to his car without looking back. I watched him drive away, realizing that his comment represented the first sign of a fundamental shift, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that my actions had been justified. As I closed the door, I felt not triumph, but a complex mixture of sadness and resolve. The confrontation was moving into a new phase, with Arthur beginning to recognize the inevitability of the change I had initiated. By morning, the financial world was buzzing with news of the leadership change at Sterling Enterprises. Financial analysts speculated about the reasons behind Arthur's abrupt resignation, while industry insiders traded rumors about the Sterling Foundation's missing funds. I arrived at the office early, determined to set the tone for Sterling's new direction. The executive floor felt different, energized yet anxious, as employees navigated the uncertain terrain of new leadership. At 9:30, Mr. Davies arrived for our scheduled meeting, bringing with him a thick folder of documents and a concerned expression. "Arthur's attorney reached out," he said without preamble as he closed my office door. "He's requesting all financial data related to the modified foundation reports that Dr. Reed presented yesterday." I nodded, unsurprised. "And he's claiming it belongs to Sterling, and therefore falls under Arthur's ongoing management rights as a founder. As the original architect of the foundation's structure, this was the move I had anticipated, Arthur attempting to maintain control over the foundation, even after his departure. His personal ego wouldn't allow him to relinquish the philanthropic arm that was supposed to be his crowning achievement. What's our position?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mr. Davies smiled slightly. "The modified reports were developed independently by Dr. Reed and her team, using knowledge they had prior to her departure. Arthur's claims extend to the original foundation structure only." "Let me guess. There's documentation proving this timeline?" "Meticulous documentation," Mr. Davies confirmed. Dr. Reed anticipated this exact scenario. Every research session was recorded, dated, and witnessed by independent parties. The intellectual property is clean. This was the final piece of my strategy, the element Arthur hadn't seen coming. While he had been focused on maintaining control through corporate maneuvering, I had been building an alternative path for the foundation that bypassed his authority entirely. "What does Arthur's lawyer say about our counterproposal?" I asked, referring to the compromise I had offered the previous evening. "They're considering it," Mr. Davies replied. "But Arthur is pushing for more, specifically, ongoing annuities from any Sterling Foundation initiative, modified or original." I shook my head. "Not possible. The ethics violations would make that untenable with the family board." My phone buzzed with a text. It was from Arthur. "We need to talk. Your office. 15 minutes. I showed it to Mr. Davies, who frowned. He shouldn't even be in the building. His access was revoked. Benedict probably let him in, I guessed. They've been brothers for 50 years. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, Arthur arrived at my office door, escorted by a clearly uncomfortable Benedict. Arthur looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. The confident executive from yesterday was gone, replaced by a man finally confronting the full consequences of his actions. "Arthur has asked for a brief meeting," Benedict explained, his tone apologetic. I took responsibility for his building access. I nodded, gesturing for Arthur to enter. "It's fine, Benedict. We'll be brief." As Benedict left, closing the door behind him, Arthur stood in the center of the office, taking in the changes I had already made to the space. Family photos removed, his awards relocated, my own materials arranged on the desk that had been his just 24 hours earlier. "I've reviewed the foundation documentation," he said without preamble. "The modified reports, the accounting protocols, the independent development timeline." I waited, allowing him to continue. "It's brilliant work," he admitted, his genuine appreciation temporarily overriding his wounded pride, "and completely beyond my legal reach." This was it, the complete revelation of just how thoroughly his position had been undermined. Not just corporate authority and ownership stakes, but the very philanthropic mission he considered his personal legacy. "You didn't just plan for my attempt to remove you," he said, realization dawning in his expression. "You created an entirely parallel financial track that I couldn't touch." For the first time since our confrontation began, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Precisely. 3 months after the family board confrontation, Sterling Enterprises and the Sterling Foundation had found their new equilibrium. The initial public relations hit following our Charity Commission disclosure had been significant, but not catastrophic, down 23% in the first week, before stabilizing as public and investors recognized our proactive approach. The modified foundation reports had been submitted as an amendment to our original annual filing, with the Charity Commission expressing cautious appreciation for our transparency. The review timeline had been extended by 6 months. but early feedback suggested eventual approval was likely. I stood at the window of the interim head's office. My office now, though I still thought of it as temporary, watching employees cross the campus courtyard below. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, nature's reminder that change was constant and often beautiful. A knock at the door interrupted my reflection. Robert, the family accountant, entered, carrying presentation materials for our upcoming donor conference. "The quarterly projections are finalized," he reported, setting the folder on my desk. "Benedict says we'll exceed expectations despite the foundation's delay. The new Meridian Philanthropy Network partnership more than made up the difference." "Excellent," I nodded. "And the revised messaging about Arthur's consultant role?" "Completed as directed," he confirmed. "We've positioned him as the pioneering visionary whose early work made Sterling possible, while highlighting Dr. Reed's team contributions to the improved foundation management." The compromise with Arthur had been finalized 2 weeks after our confrontation. He had accepted the founder emeritus title and a limited consulting arrangement focused solely on historical venture projects, with no management authority or access to current development data. The arrangement preserved his professional legacy while keeping him at a safe distance from operations. "Has there been any feedback from the press about Arthur and Felicity?" I asked. Robert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing my personal situation. "Some gossip in industry publications, but it's dying down. Their relocation to San Francisco has helped reduce local interest." Arthur and Felicity had indeed moved to San Francisco, where she had secured a position with a smaller tech startup. While the industry was too small for their actions to go completely unnoticed, the geographical distance had allowed the personal drama to fade from immediate attention. After Robert left, I reviewed the day's schedule. The search committee for a permanent head of the Sterling Family Trust was meeting that afternoon, a process I had insisted on despite the family board's suggestion that I remain in the role permanently. While I had discovered unexpected satisfaction in leading Sterling through its crisis, my talents and interests remained more aligned with strategic relationships and ethical oversight than day-to-day executive functions. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Davies. "Divorce papers finalized. Arthur signed without amendments. Closing this chapter for you." A wave of mixed emotions washed over me. Relief, sadness, and finally, a sense of freedom. The legal dissolution of my 50-year marriage felt strangely anticlimactic after the professional separation had been so dramatic. I texted back a simple, "Thank you for everything." Later that afternoon, I walked across campus to the Foundation's building, where Dr. Reed had established her team in newly renovated offices. The space hummed with purposeful energy, researchers moving between workstations with the focused intensity that had characterized Sterling in its early days. "The impact data looks promising," Dr. Reed reported as she showed me their latest results. "The modified funding allocation is reaching nearly 60% more beneficiaries compared to the original distribution. Greater patient outcomes with fewer side effects," I observed. "Exactly what we should have prioritized from the beginning." "Philanthropy done right takes time," she replied, with the wisdom of her decades in nonprofit work. "Shortcuts only create longer delays." In the end, as I left the Foundation offices, I passed the wall where we had recently installed a simple plaque commemorating Mr. Henderson's founding principles: integrity in service of community, ethics in service of legacy. A daily reminder of the values that had nearly been lost in the pursuit of faster returns and higher public acclaim. Outside, the family campus stretched before me. Buildings that housed nearly 600 employees, working on ventures that would help thousands. The institution was larger than any individual, more enduring than any single product or leadership team. In the end, that was what I had fought to protect. Not just my position or pride, but the integrity of something worth preserving. Whatever personal price I had paid seemed a fair exchange for that accomplishment. 6 months after the family board revelation, I found myself back at the Grand Hotel, the venue where Arthur had planned to celebrate his revised will and engagement announcement. The irony wasn't lost on me as I waited in the private dining room where philanthropic industry leaders had gathered for the annual Visionary Leadership Awards. Sterling Enterprises had been nominated for the Ethics in Philanthropy Award, a recognition of our transparent handling of the Foundation's financial issues and our commitment to community impact over expedited public relations. The nomination itself was a victory, proof that our industry valued integrity, even when it came at a financial cost. I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue gown, chosen carefully for this evening, where I would likely encounter Arthur for the first time since the divorce was finalized. As interim head, I would represent Sterling while the search for my permanent replacement continued. The cocktail hour buzzed with conversation around me, executives and philanthropists networking in the carefully choreographed dance of industry relationships. I was engaged in a discussion with the Charity Commission's associate director when I sensed a familiar presence behind me. "Congratulations on the nomination," Arthur said as I turned to face him. "Well deserved." He looked different, more rested than during our last encounter. The sharp edges of bitterness somewhat softened. San Francisco apparently agreed with him. "Thank you," I replied, genuinely surprised by his gracious tone. "I didn't expect to see you here." "The awards committee still wanted my input," he explained with a small shrug. "Some things are hard to give up entirely." The associate director discreetly excused herself, leaving us in a momentary bubble of privacy despite the crowded room. "How is the Foundation's review progressing?" Arthur asked, his professional curiosity evidently undiminished. "Impact data is strong," I answered. "The modified funding allocation is showing greater reach and efficacy equal to the original, with significantly reduced administrative overhead. Charity Commission seems cautiously optimistic." He nodded, professional satisfaction briefly visible in his expression. "And Felicity? Any issues with her departure package?" "All settled according to the agreement," I assured him. The severance had been generous despite the circumstances. Another component of the compromise that had allowed for a clean break. An awkward silence fell between us. 50 years of shared history making small talk impossible but deeper conversation too painful. "I saw the announcement about the Thomas Henderson Legacy Fund," Arthur said finally. "The scholarship program for business ethics studies is a fitting tribute." "It was Mr. Henderson's idea originally," I acknowledged. "One of many suggestions in his letters that we're finally implementing." Arthur's expression turned reflective. He saw things more clearly than the rest of us. Especially me. The simple admission, so contrary to Arthur's usual reluctance to acknowledge mistakes, caught me off guard. Before I could respond, the dinner chimes rang, signaling guests to find their tables. "I should go," Arthur said. "I'm seated with the San Francisco delegation." As he turned to leave, he hesitated, then added quietly, "For what it's worth, Agnes, you were right about everything. The Foundation, the family, us." He met my eyes directly. I lost sight of why we started all this in the first place. The simple acknowledgement, delivered without expectation or agenda, felt like the closing of a circle begun 50 years ago, when an idealistic entrepreneur knocked on my office door. "We both built something worthwhile," I replied. "That doesn't disappear, even if we couldn't sustain everything else." He nodded once, accepting the measured reconciliation I offered. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of the complex truth of our shared history. "Goodbye, Agnes," he said simply, then turned and walked toward his table on the other side of the room. I watched him go, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't fully acknowledged was still there. The personal chapter was truly closing now, not with bitterness or triumph, but with the quiet dignity of mutual recognition. Later that evening, when Sterling Enterprises was announced as the Ethics in Philanthropy Award winner, I accepted the Crystal Trophy with a speech that acknowledged all who had contributed to restoring the family's ethical foundation. I did not name Arthur specifically, but I included a line about the pioneering vision that made our ventures possible. A small acknowledgement of the entrepreneur he had once been, separate from the patriarch he had become. As I returned to my seat, award in hand, I caught his eye across the room. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture between former partners who had built something significant, lost their way, and found separate paths forward. I returned the gesture, then turned my attention to the colleagues surrounding me, the present and future of Sterling Enterprises, now restored to its founding principles. 1 year to the day after Arthur and Felicity had attempted to disinherit me, I stood at the podium in Sterling's main auditorium, addressing the assembled employees. The company had changed significantly in those 12 months. New leadership, renewed focus on ethical investments, and a corporate culture that valued integrity over expedited returns. Today marks my final day as interim head of the Sterling Family Trust, I announced to the gathered staff. The family board has selected Dr. Evelyn Reed as my successor effective tomorrow morning. Applause erupted throughout the room. Dr. Reed's appointment represented the perfect synthesis of ethical expertise and visionary leadership, exactly what Sterling needed to move forward. Under Dr. Reed's guidance, Sterling will continue prioritizing community impact over quarterly projections, I continued. The revitalized Sterling Foundation, now a beacon of transparency in philanthropy, stands as testament to what we can achieve when we honor our founding principles. As I concluded my remarks, I touched the small silver pin on my lapel, Mr. Henderson's personal logo that he had given to those he considered part of his inner circle. I had found it among his effects after his death, with a note asking that I wear it when the time is right. Today felt like that time. Later, in the privacy of my office, soon to be Dr. Reed's office, I completed the final task of my interim leadership. I signed the documents establishing my new role, chairperson of the Ethics Oversight Committee, with a permanent family board seat and authority to review all financial protocols and corporate decisions for alignment with Sterling's core values. It wasn't the quiet matriarchal position I had once held, nor the interim CEO role I had temporarily assumed. It was something more fitting, a position that would allow me to be the family's conscience, just as Mr. Henderson had once described me. Benedict knocked gently on my open door. "Car's ready whenever you are," he said. "The movers finished at the lake house this morning." I nodded, gathering my personal items into a small box. I had sold Sterling Manor, choosing instead the lakeside property that had always been my personal sanctuary. The fresh start felt appropriate as I closed this chapter of my professional life. "Any regrets?" Benedict asked as we walked toward the elevator. I considered the question carefully. The past year had brought professional triumph alongside personal loss. The end of my marriage, the stress of corporate restructuring, the scrutiny of industry observers watching Sterling's every move. No regrets, I answered honestly. Some sadness for what couldn't be saved, but pride in what was. As we drove away from Sterling's campus, I looked back at the buildings silhouetted against the setting sun. What had begun as a personal betrayal, my husband and his assistant attempting to disinherit me, had catalyzed something unexpected. The reclamation of a family legacy's soul, and the discovery of my own strength. The family would continue its work long after all of us were gone. Communities would benefit from initiatives developed with integrity rather than expediency. And somewhere, I like to think, Mr. Henderson was watching, satisfied that his faith in me had been justified. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats. And sometimes, being underestimated is the most powerful advantage of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.